In the first portion of this video on Proverbs 1 through 9, we left off with verse 5. In verse 5, the sage gave us the means to his intended end. The end was developing character, verses 3 through 4. The means had to do with cultivating receptivity both in the wise and in the naive. That brings us to section 2, part C, verses 6 through 9. Here we find the sage providing us with the book's literary tools and then literary exhibits. The expression, quote, for perceiving, end quote, that's found in verse 2b returns again in verse 6a. Again, that indicates that verse 2 functions as a dual theme introduction, and now we're picking up the second portion that was prefigured in 2b and unfolded starting in verse 6. Here the sage will unfold that topic of literary tools. Just as the book's aim was presented as a catalog of character traits in 3 and 4, followed by an exhortation aimed at two characters, namely the wise and the naive, in 5a and 5b. So now the literary tools of the wisdom craft will be presented first as a catalog of literary tools, verse 6, followed by two literary exhibits, that is, actual wise sayings, that appear in verse 7 and in verses 8 and 9. Notice first, then, the catalog of literary tools in verse 6. It's a 4-item catalog. Here the sage lists the various sorts of wisdom compositions that the reader may encounter in the book of Proverbs. It's something like introducing the topic of recipes and then giving 4 sample recipes, or introducing the idea of travel and then saying you can travel by foot, by car, by rail, by ski. The fact that comment concerning form, namely the catalog of sapiential forms in verse 6, trails after and occupies considerably less space than the sage's teaching about content, form versus content. By content, we're recalling that verses 3 through 5 gave a description of character formation, not literary forms. So once again, this fact that the comment about forms of literary expression comes after teaching about content, wisdom content, and is much shorter, sends a salient message. While winsome literary style does hold value, and as our study progresses, I trust you'll be impressed with the sophisticated ability of the sage to compose compressed and highly refined verbal expression. So winsome style does hold value. It ever must remain secondary, subordinate to the higher imperative of personal formation, that is, character development. If instead the sage's primary aim were merely to assemble an impressive catalog of sayings, he would likely have located this formulated component, verse 6, ahead of the content teaching of verses 3 through 5. For clever expression at the expense of character cultivation amounts to dereliction of sapiential duty. While some have hypothesized that the 4 forms listed in verse 6 may correspond sequentially to subsequent portions of Proverbs, without a fuller grasp of the connotation of each term, this proposal must remain only a tantalizing hypothesis. However, since 3 of these 4 form terms appear in the same sequence in Habakkuk 2:6, that trio may have comprised something of a stock catalog, a sort of composer's repertoire. Of the 4 in Proverbs, only the expression words of the wise is omitted from the trio in Habakkuk. The first form in verse 6 is proverb, or mashal in Hebrew, which resumes the opening word of the chapter, verse 1, part A, Mishle Shlomo, the Proverbs of Solomon. This term arises either from the concept of comparing or the concept of ruling. Both meanings are germane, since on the one hand, the sage often teaches by comparison. Consider, for example, the so-called better saying form, where entity A is compared favorably and usually paradoxically to entity B. As in this example, better to be contemptible while owning a servant than pompous while lacking food. One condition is compared to another. Consequently, mashal or proverb with the root meaning of comparison is suitable for wisdom composition. On the other hand, many proverbs deal with the second meaning of mashal, that is ruling, whether in the king's realm or in the realm of personal self-rule. In the king's realm, consider this from Proverbs 14:35. An adept servant enjoys a king's favor, but his rage will bring shame. Or in Proverbs 21:23 concerning self-rule, one who guards his mouth and his tongue guards his life from troubles. So, the term proverbs, mashal, as tracing either to comparison or to rule, either way, it works, and may in fact be, in the sage's mind, an intentional wordplay. The second term in verse 6 is elusive expression, melitza. This may also be rendered a mocking poem. By way of illustration, while the following saying speaks about eating, it alludes to a wider life situation. Proverbs 15:17 reads, "Better a meal of greens," that is, mere simple vegetables, "when love is there, than fattened cattle with hatred." A mocking tone emerges from the polished satire also that we find against drunkenness in Proverbs 23:29 and following. So, melitza, a mocking poem, is one of the forms that we find in Proverbs 1 verse 6, translated here as an elusive expression. Third, the expression words of the wise, divrei chachamim, will wind up heading an entire section that begins in Proverbs 22:17. Multiple sayings across Proverbs reference the tongue, teaching, or lips of the wise. Finally, clever sayings. Clever sayings is the Hebrew term chidot. Literally, it refers to things that are sharp. This may point both to the refined craftsmanship evident in wisdom compositions, as in the use of concrete analogies to breathe life into abstract values, such as in the richly extended metaphor of Lady Wisdom. Alternatively, it may refer to the meddlesome pricking of conscience inflicted by observations like this one in Proverbs 24:33 and 34. Can you feel the sharpness, the goad, the prick here? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to recline, and your poverty will come on you as a vagabond, and your lack like an armed man. So clever sayings may refer either to refined craftsmanship, because the sage has worked so hard to fashion very concise, clever sayings. Alternatively, the clever sayings, meaning something that's sharp, may imply the notion of them being a pricking goad. That leads us to Proverbs 7 through 9, where we turn from a catalog of sayings to actual examples or exhibits of wise statements. Following the catalog of literary tools in verse 6, the sage presents two exhibits of sapiential composition. It's instructive that the two principal forms into which the balance of the book's sayings may be grouped are here illustrated. So in verse 7, we see a saying or an apothegm, an aphorism, with its characteristic lack of any command. A command is implicit but not explicit. In contrast, when we come to verse 8, we see the imperative or admonition, distinguished by its use of a command form. Further, this particular imperative finds support with an incentive. It's buttressed by the incentive that follows in verse 9. This two-step pattern of imperative plus incentive the sage will often employ. We'll see them frequently, for example, in Proverbs 3, the first 12 verses. Thus, the forms that are showcased for us in verses 7 through 9 of chapter 1 are highly representative of subsequent composition, whether the apothegm without its command or the imperative with its command plus an incentive. That speaks to the form of these exhibits of sayings in 7 through 9. Now let's turn to the content. The content of these samples is not incidental. The first, verse 7, sets humankind in reverential relationship toward the divine, and the second sets child in receptive relationship toward his parent. These two principles are overwhelmingly foundational in the sage's understanding of the entire universe. Let's focus now on verse 7. In reverence lies wisdom's foundation, its very source. While a relatively common word with 51 occurrences in the Hebrew Bible, one cannot help but wonder whether the appearance of the noun beginning that we find here in verse 7, rendered in my translation as epitome, one cannot help but wonder whether this word, located as it is toward the start of this book, may not be intended to recall another book where that very word stands at the very start, Genesis 1:1, preceded only by the preposition in the beginning. It may be instructive to note that in other contexts, this word, which is reshit, may also designate first fruit or choicest portion, alluding to an undertone here of the choicest aspect of knowledge displays itself as reverence for the Lord. Next, consider the word fear, which in Hebrew is yirah. While this term is capable of conveying the notion of terror or fright, that domain belongs more consistently to another cluster of Hebrew words, pachad, magor, be'ata, or chared. Consequently, reverential awe, or a rich and robust tone of respect, better represent yirah in this situation of Proverbs 1:7. It's noteworthy that reference to the divine here signifies not God generally, that Hebrew term would have been Elohim, but the God of Israel in particular, which sometimes is represented as Yahweh. Unlike the sage of Ecclesiastes, who for reasons of his own refrains from naming the God of Israel, the writer of Proverbs, with the first reference to the divine, posts his allegiance to the God who originated the Sinai covenant with Israel. Employing the simple device of antithetical parallelism, the second hemistich of verse 7 produces an alternative which reveals those veering away from wisdom's starting point. By disdaining the way of wisdom with attendant disciplines, they reveal themselves to be fools. Such a one is not merely clueless, but morally deficient. Now, there is a dilemma associated with the clustering of verse 7. Should it stand isolated, alone from surrounding composition, or does it share traits that link it to adjacent material? New Revised Standard, New American Standard, and New International Version set verse 7 apart, both from verse 6 and even more so from verse 8. Modern editors insert a heading that is not found in the Hebrew before verse 8. The Standard Hebrew Bible, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, separates verse 7 from verses 1 through 6 and joins it more closely to verses 8 to 9 instead. In contrast, we see that the Hebrew Masoretes joined verse 7 with the first 6 verses. That's evident by the degree of spacing that they inserted in their manuscript. How then shall we resolve this difference of interpretational opinion? Structural evidence indicates that verse 7 does not stand alone, but shares features with surrounding material. First, verse 7 reproduces in precise succession and consecutive proximity a trio of terms that were found earlier in this poem. And here is the string. To know, or knowledge, and wisdom and discipline. Those three terms. They open verse 2, and then they recur in verse 7. And incidentally, they show up in that trio, that sequence, nowhere else in all of the Hebrew Bible. Such a concentration of intentional sequencing of wisdom terms in verse 7 seems calculated to remind the reader and form a link then back to verse 2. Second, talk of various styles of utterance, such as we encountered in the catalog of forms in verse 6, would reasonably stir in the reader the anticipation soon to find a sample of at least one of those forms of utterance. A sample such as is conveniently provided by, first, the apothegm comprising verse 7, and second, by another sample, the imperative plus incentive comprising verses 8 and 9. There is a third reason structurally for seeing 7 as connected to surrounding verses. It would seem appropriate to follow the extended emphasis on character development that we found in verses 2 to 5, with a teaching specifically calculated to instill such character. Reverence for God, as is exhorted in verse 7, as well as respect for parents, exhorted in verses 8 and 9, belong to this matter of character formation, not to some other topics that we'll find elsewhere in Proverbs, such as advice for economic success or a healthy home life. In view of these three correlations with verses 1 through 6, we may conclude with a high degree of certainty that the sage produced verse 7 together with verses 8 and 9 in order to provide exhibits illustrating what sapiential utterances might look like. Keep in mind the list of forms in verse 6. And also in order to illustrate what character formation might look like. Recall the thrust of the content in verses 2 through 5. The degree of care taken in crafting verses 2 through 5 encourages us to conclude that the apothegm in verse 7 and the exhortation in 8 and 9 were not selected haphazardly. Rather, we're more correct to conclude just the opposite. The author considered reverence for God, verse 7, not only as the epitome of knowledge, but as the supreme saying in all of his collection. Here he has, as it were, tipped his hand, disclosing here in the prologue to the entire book his very finest conclusion. What Bruce Waltke in his commentary calls the quintessential expression of the basic spiritual grammar for understanding the book. And receptivity to parents, verses 8 and 9, ranked as a close second. This lecture will continue in the next video.